To the other big political story of the week, the Senate inquiry into the Newman government. The Liberal National Party called it an unprincipled stunt and nothing more than a bitch session. To answer those criticisms, I was joined in the studio earlier today by Greens Senator Larissa Waters, who will sit on the inquiry as it travels the state early next year. Senator Waters, this inquiry is going to investigate its political enemies. Do you see a conflict of interest there?
Look, the Greens were really cautious when we were discussing the scope of this inquiry to make sure that it would deal with an even hand to all parties. So I'm really proud that we were able to have included in the terms of reference not just the scope to examine the environmental track record of the Newman government, which is atrocious, but also to look back in time and look at the terrible political interference around the coal seam gas approvals issued under the former Bligh Government, and also to make sure that we can look at Mr Clive Palmer's own development interests. So I'm hopeful that we'll be able to ventilate those issues in an impartial way.
Well, normally it's done by an independent set of people, like in the Pink Bats inquiry, for instance, where you've at least got that separation that the politicians aren't investigating politicians with your own motives of re-election and whatnot. But this time you don't have any of that, and that seems to be the reason why it doesn't happen before now.
Well, look, this sort of thing has happened a few times before, but as I say, we were really careful when looking at whether or not to support this inquiry to make sure that the Senate would be acting within the scope of its powers and that we weren't pushing the boundaries, and we were looking at things that were appropriate to look at and were within the jurisdiction of the Senate. So I'm comfortable that we've done that in the terms of reference. And in the conduct of the inquiry, wherever there's any sort of legal grey area, the Greens will err on the side of caution to make sure that the Senate inquiry is conducting itself properly and within the scope of its powers.
Does it bother you at all that you're siding with Clive Palmer, who fell out with the Newman government over a resource project?
Look, my concern is to make sure that we can examine the environmental track record of the Newman government, look at those dodgy coal seam gas approvals under the former government, and look at Mr Palmer's own development projects. So I don't get bogged down in the motives of other people. I saw this as a chance and an opportunity to expose those issues and to hear from whistleblowers about what really goes on and the political interference, sadly, that's plagued approvals in Queensland.
It does seem slightly opportunistic by the Greens, though, because in order for you to accept the inquiry, you gain from PUP that they would block the changes to environmental approvals for resource projects. So it seems like you're quite pragmatic over principle there.
Well, look, I've been fighting, and the Greens have been fighting against this plan to put state premiers in complete control of the environment. This whole one-stop shop notion to ditch federal environmental responsibilities, it's a terrible idea, and we've been campaigning against it ever since the last government proposed it, before the Abbott government now took it on. Now, the chance that we saw here with this inquiry was to say to the Palmer Party, if you think the Newman government are so dodgy that they need an inquiry into them, well, why would you vote to give them more powers over the environment? Why would you give them more responsibility over things if you think that they're not a proper administration? So I'm really pleased that the logic of that was received by the Palmer Party, and they've agreed that they will vote with the Greens and the Labor Party to stop this wholesale attack on our federal environmental protections. It's a really good win for the environment, and we now also have an inquiry that looks at those issues as well. So it's a good outcome from my perspective.
You're going to call MPs, government MPs from Queensland?
Look, we'll be seeking to hear evidence from government MPs from Queensland, from Mr Palmer himself.
But if they say no, will you force them?
The grey area is when they decline to give evidence, and the Senate practices and procedures are pretty clear in that you shouldn't overstep that mark. So we'll be making the invitation.
Same for that?
It's the same rule with that. So we'll be making the invitation, and it may well be that none of those folk decide to appear, in which case...
And then you're not even examining both sides of the issue, so that would then colour the inquiry, wouldn't it?
Well, I'm still hopeful that there'll be a number of whistleblowers that will come forward. We know already that people have blown the whistle on, for example, the dodgy Gladstone Harbour practices, the coal seam gas approvals in the last government.
But it's not going to be balanced, is it? If you have just what Senator Erica Betts calls a bitch session about Queensland, but if you don't have anyone from the other side, then surely you've got a problem.
Well, I guess if those state members of parliament feel that their name's been besmirched and they want to take the opportunity to clear their name, if that's the evidence that they think they can give, then that will be an option open to them. But we're not going to compel witnesses from another from another House of Parliament to give evidence. That's where you get into a legal grey area, and this should not be anything that ends up in the courts. This should be an impartial and proper Senate inquiry to ventilate the issues.
Do you see, though, the problem that you're creating? And Senator Eric Abetz already hinted it in the Senate when he said, just keep in mind that one of these days the numbers may well turn around. So there's going to be tit for tat.
Well, look, unfortunately the Abbott government is quite vindictive, and that's sadly how much of the parliament operates.
But does this serve Australians if you've got different levels of government investigating each other and obviously spending taxpayers' money doing it?
Look, that's why when we looked at the terms of reference, we made sure that this was something appropriate for the Senate to examine and that we could do so within the scope of the Senate's powers. I think the attacks on Queensland's environment have gone so far that they're actually breaching our international environmental obligations. Now, that's something that the Commonwealth is charged with looking after, and so I think this Senate inquiry is a perfectly appropriate means to investigate that, particularly since we don't have an upper house in Queensland and there is no accountability in our unicameral parliament.
All right, Senator Waters, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Matt.